Welcome to the Kundalini Collective podcast. Today we have Michael Bradford. Michael Bradford was a follower of the famous Gopi Krishna. Gopi Krishna was somebody who helped spread information about Kundalini in the West in the 1970s, and the author of the book Kundalini, the Evolutionary Energy in Man. Michael Bradford also helped started the Institute for Consciousness Research, or I.C.R, and was director of the publications. He was also one of the founder members of the Kundalini Research Network, along with Bonnie Greenwell, Yvonne K.R.N, Lawrence Edwards, and others. So he's got I would almost say, a prestigious history in the West of helping bring the knowledge of Kundalini to people. And Michael is here with us today. So Michael, just if you can tell us more about yourself, about Gopi Krishna, and about how you came across Kundalini and Gopi Krishna, and just introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Samir. And I would like to thank you and Alan for this opportunity to speak today. My interest in the subject goes back a long way. And in fact, even when I was a child, I had a keen interest in science fiction. Like I read out the science fiction library in the children's section of our library. Then I went on to the adult section. So I've always had this keen interest in the unusual, the paranormal or whatever. And it was in 1967. I was in grade 11 at the time. And a friend of mine, who I think most of my fellow classmates considered a little weird, gave me a book called The Third Eye by Lobsang Rampa. And in that book, in several places, he mentions Kundalini. And I didn't really pay too much attention to it. I just made a note of it. Well, this sounds interesting. And I didn't really follow up on it at that time. But my interest shifted from science fiction into the paranormal at that point. Then in I guess it was 1976 in Toronto. I was living in Toronto at the time. And I had joined up with a meditation group in Toronto. And the founder of that group came to know about Gopi Krishna and actually flew to Europe to meet him while Gopi Krishna was on a visit from India. And together, they decided to have a conference on Kundalini in India in August of 1977. So in that month, the members of the Institute, and there was something like 234 of us, I believe, we all got on a jumbo jet and flew to New Delhi and then on to Kashmir, where Gopi Krishna gave a week-long series of discourses on Kundalini. And while we were there, he expressed an interest in having some of the members of the group come back and work for him as volunteers, because he had, even though his autobiography had been published, he had 8 or 10 other books at least that he wanted to publish, but he was basically worked on his own. So in December of 1977, I flew to India with 3 other Canadians, and we were there as a group. Other people came over later, some went back. I was there for 2 years, from December 77 to the end of 79. I came back to Canada for a year. And then in early 1981, I flew back to India and stayed there until the end of 1984, which is about 5 months after Gopi Krishna died. And while I was there, my work was mostly concerned with publishing his books, going to presses, getting proofs, reading the proofs, shipping books out to distributors and all that kind of thing. But also, too, I was doing some research work in mystics of India, because Gopi Krishna felt that there was a huge amount of information that could be gleaned from their, writings about them. So early in 1985, after I came back, I got together with some of the members of the meditation group, which had since disbanded, and we formed an organization which eventually became the Institute for Consciousness Research, or I.C.R. From 1985 till the present day, my primary role in I.C.R. has been director of publications, and I was responsible for publishing, first of all, his printed books in the 1980s and 1990s, because there were a number of his books that he had wanted to be published that never got published before he died. So we published those. And then in starting around, I think 2006 or 7 or 8, I started converting all of them into ebooks on Amazon and Smashwords. And now we have more than 20 books of his on Amazon. And in the last 5 or 6 years, I've been converting, I think, 8 of his books now into audiobooks. So we're really trying to make his writings available to the world. So that has been my primary role. But while I'm doing all this, keep in mind, I'm reading and rereading and rereading and rereading all of his books over and over again, because every time we initially publish them or convert to a new format, they all had to be proofed again, either by reading them in the case of an ebook or listening in the case of an audiobook. So for something like 47 years, I've been reading his material. So I.C.R. Is still quite active, although at this point, we're mostly focused on producing more audiobooks. So the other aspect of my career, you might say, which is relevant here, is that, as I said, I've always had a keen interest in science. And after I graduated from university I had a degree in computer science. I had originally wanted to go and be a physicist because I loved nuclear physics, but I didn't have the mathematics to do that. So I ended up in computers. But even after university, to the present day, I have maintained a keen interest in science, in cosmology, neuroscience, microbiology, things like that, subjects that are really closely related to Kundalini and how it works. Around 2015, maybe a little bit earlier, I decided to collect together a number of articles I'd written on Kundalini and publish them in a book format. One day I turned on my computer, and it was my habit at that time that the very first thing I would do after turning on my computer was go to NASA's Astronomy Picture of the Day website, because I love, they would talk about galaxies and planets and black holes and things like that. On this particular day, they did something very different. It was a graphic animation of a strand of DNA being replicated. And it showed this DNA ladder that was being split down the middle, and the one went off in the one direction, and it was reassembled into a complete ladder. The other was thrown out in whirling loops that were replicated backwards. I looked at this and I was just flabbergasted. I could not believe what I was seeing. And I thought, oh my God, this is Kundalini that's doing this. And it was a turning point in my life. After that, I started studying microbiology to try and figure out, well, what is all this? How does it all work? And I was really shocked when I started studying microbiology, not by what they knew about how these processes work, but what they didn't know about how they worked. And I'd look at one thing after the other, like how a cell divides or how protein is created. And I just had this big long list of questions. Well, why does it do that? How can it do this? What is guiding and controlling it? And the answers weren't there. They just were not there. And so I wrote about this in a book, which is called Consciousness, the New Paradigm. And in the book, I address a whole range of issues, questions which science cannot answer, and how this paradigm of reality that comes from the Indian spiritual tradition, if you incorporate some of the aspects of that paradigm into modern science, then you can answer many of the questions which science alone cannot answer. And so I talked about the Indian spiritual tradition, and I have a chapter on Kundalini, including a section on Gopi Krishna's model. And then I talk about other aspects of life, how life can function and the relationship of Kundalini to life. So that is something that I did, I guess, in 2015. And since then, I've really been trying to put together, based upon my experience, a simple, rational, logical, and as much as possible, scientific way of explaining Kundalini. Now, the other aspect of my history, which is majorly relevant here, is that in 1995, I guess it was going on almost 30 years ago, I started studying the Vedic tradition of ancient India. And my teacher was a fellow named Hart Defoe, now retired, who lives in Toronto. And I spent 30 years studying the Vedic tradition, which is really the root tradition of India, from which all the other major spiritual traditions emerged from later. And so by immersing my mind in these Vedic symbols, these Vedic ideas, and learning how they did things in this tradition, it's given me an even better insight into Kundalini, how it works, what it does, how it does it. So combining those three things together, my interest in science, which has been a lifelong passionate interest of mine, my work with Gopi Krishna, and the 29 now years of immersion in the Vedic tradition of India, which included learning Sanskrit. Because unless you learn Sanskrit, it's extremely difficult to really understand the Indian spiritual tradition, because many of the ideas in that tradition are foreign to the Western way of thinking. And unless you learn Sanskrit, you're going to read books that are translated into English and come away with a lot of things, ideas that are really not true. They're misconceptions, and there's a lot of confusion over that. So that is my basic history. And as I said, I'm trying to put together a way of explaining Kundalini that is rational and logical. It makes sense. It's scientific as much as possible. Now, I'd just like to take a few minutes at this point and talk about Gopi Krishna. He was born in 1904 in Kashmir, from a very poor family. He moved to Lahore on the plains of India when he was quite young. And when he was, I believe, 17 years old, he had a major turning point in his life, because rather than studying his school texts, he decided to read novels instead, and he failed the entrance examination for the college. And so he decided at that point that he would never let his wayward nature control his fate. So he started to meditate, and he soon brought this up to the point where he was meditating 3 hours a day, every day in the morning. He would get up before sunrise, and he would meditate for 3 hours. And he did this every day. Even the morning after he got married, he got up and did his 3 hours of meditation. That's how dedicated and devoted he was to it. After 17 years of this meditation, where he was sitting there focusing intensely on this image of a lotus above his head, this lotus in full bloom, this radiating beams of light. After 17 years of doing this, Kundalini suddenly exploded. This current of Kundalini came up his spine, and at first it went back down. He had to refocus. He did this several times. Finally, it went into his brain, and the description he gave of that, like a stream of liquid light entering my brain, is one of the most classic descriptions of Kundalini you will find anywhere. However, even though he came back more or less to a state of normal consciousness afterwards, not totally normal, but mostly normal, Kundalini almost killed him at that point. He had awakened it in, as he described later, a nadi, a channel, which tended to generate heat in his body, and he almost burned up from it. And it took about a month before he finally was able to focus his mind enough to change the direction of the current so that it went through Sushumna Nadi and up into the brain. And this burning hot energy, which was literally killing him, suddenly turned into this beautiful, effulgent, soothing cascade of light that went up into his brain and all through his body. That was the beginning of a 12-year process of transformation. 12 years. And he said that during this time, although he more or less came back to a state of normal consciousness, it wasn't really normal in the sense that it's very difficult to describe because I never experienced it myself. But he said that the mental mirror, like each of us has a sense of our consciousness which for me anyway, is located in and around my head. It's like a small bubble in my head. He said in his case, after the initial awakening, this expanded into a much larger bubble. He said the surface of the mental mirror was greatly expanded. And the other thing he noticed was that everything he looked at seemed to be covered with a layer of chalk dust. And he found this odd. It didn't impact his vision, but it was just very bizarre. It seemed like there was this white coating of dust on everything. So over the next 12 years, Kundalini was majorly active in his body. He said to us once that he would wake up in the middle of the night and there would be this storm of activity going on in his body while he was sleeping. And he felt that Kundalini was literally rebuilding his body from the inside out, his brain, nervous system, even the internal organs. And then, I guess about 10 years after the awakening, he was walking around the government buildings where he worked. He worked as a civil servant for most of his life. He was walking around at lunch one day, and he looked up at the facade of one of the buildings. And this layer of chalk dust had morphed into a ravishingly beautiful golden silvery luster. And he said it was just astounding. It's like everything he looked at from that point on was bathed in this beautiful golden luster. And he was just totally amazed. And then he said his sense of hearing also changed. Sounds became more melodic and beautiful. But he still possessed a more or less normal state of consciousness. Then 12 years after the initial awakening, this was in 1949, he was walking with a friend on a bridge in the city of Jammu, which was part of the state of Jammu and Kashmir in northern India. And he found that these beautiful Kashmiri lines of poetry had come into his head. And he was just amazed at the quality because he never had any ability to write poetry before. And so he went back to where he was staying and ate his dinner. And then just as he was in the middle of eating his dinner, his consciousness just expanded and merged into the universal consciousness. And it is the most beautiful description I have ever read anywhere of Kundalini and how it works. It's not easy to understand. He said he talked about how this image, how this point of consciousness, he described it as being, if you can believe it, infinitely large and infinitely small at the same time. I mean, I've never been able to wrap my mind around that. Maybe you can do better. But he said he perceived the entire physical creation being projected from a point of consciousness within him. He said, and I think this is a fairly close quote, he said, it was as if an image as vast as my conception of the cosmos were thrown out upon infinity by a projector no bigger than a pinpoint. He said the entire physical creation was coming from this point of consciousness within him. And from that point on, he more or less entered a stage where he could literally, just by shifting his focus, take his mind away from the external physical world that we perceive with our five senses. That physical world would melt away into this ocean of infinite consciousness and bliss. He could do this at will. And this was the result of this 12 years of transformation. And he lived in that state for the rest of his life. I mean, we would be sitting there, eating dinner with him, and then he'd just go off into this state where, we would just stop talking and, not interrupt him. As a personal experience, one day I had to go and see him because he had asked me to create some chapter titles for one of his books that we were publishing. So I came up with what I thought were some reasonably good titles, and I went over. We lived about a block away from where he lived in New Delhi at the time. And I went over to see him and knocked on the door, and his daughter-in-law came to the door and answered. And I said, could I see Pandit Ji? And she said, sure, please come in and sit down. So I went and sat in their living room. And about 10 minutes later, he came down and sat down. And I said, Pandit Ji, I've come up with some titles for this book, and I just wanted to go over them with you to see what you think. And I started to describe, to tell them what some of the titles were. After a couple of minutes, he put up his hand and he stopped me and he said, if you had any idea where I've had to bring my mind back from. He would not be troubling me with these questions. And it just showed, when he was in this writing mood, it was absolutely amazing. And one of the hallmarks of enlightenment in India. Now, I want to make it very clear that Gopi Krishna never claimed to be enlightened. He said this in his speeches and in his books. He said, I do not claim to be enlightened. But if you look at the characteristics of an enlightened person that he said you would see, he fitted every one of them to a T. Now, one of the major characteristics of a person who is enlightened is revelation. Now, revelation is sometimes confused with inspiration. Now, many people have inspiration. They're working on something and ideas come into their head, connections that nobody else has ever seen before. Maybe an artist is painting a picture, they're guided by something. So a lot of people, many, many, many people have inspiration to one degree or another. I mean, some of them are very pronounced, like say a Mozart or, a Leonardo da Vinci or whatever. But most people have some degree of inspiration. But the thing is, with inspiration, you do not have any awareness of where this wisdom, this knowledge is coming from. It just comes into your head. Revelation is totally different in that you perceive directly the intelligence from where this wisdom, this knowledge is coming from. And Gopi Krishna's words, the way he described it, he said, when I perceive this intelligence, I am humbled to dust. Those were his exact words. He said, it is so vast, so powerful. He said, I feel like nothing when I compare my own intelligence to it. So after the experience in 1949, where he had this poetry come to him, he started writing poetry. And first of all, it came to him in Kashmiri, then in other languages that he knew, like Hindi, Urdu, English. But then one day, he started receiving verses in I think it was French. I'm not sure which one of the European languages, a language that he had never seen written and to the best of his knowledge had never heard spoken in his lifetime. And he started writing out this poetry. And then other poetry came to him in German, Italian, Persian, other languages that he had no knowledge of. And this was beautiful, mystical poetry. We published this poetry in a book called From the Unseen on Amazon. So if you're interested in getting it, you can read this. But it was just something that went with him for the rest of his life. And so he started writing in poetry, and he could write an entire book of verse in a week or two. I'm talking about a full-length book, perfectly rhymed, perfectly metered, and it would just flow out of him. He would just write it out. It wasn't that he would go, this line ends with this word, what can I do on the next line to make it rhyme with? No, it just came out in one perfect flow. And maybe sometimes at the end, he'd rearrange some of the sections, and that was it. And even it came into his correspondence, and you will maybe find this interesting. Back in the early 1970s, the Apollo 14 astronaut, Edgar Mitchell, had left NASA, and he was trying to encourage research into psychic phenomenon. I believe he was involved with the creation of IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And he wrote a letter to Gopi Krishna asking for his support with this research. Gopi Krishna wrote a letter back and said that he didn't believe that this research would really be of much value. He said, we've been studying psychic phenomena for more than 200 years, and we still have no better idea now than we did when we started as to what it is or where they come from. So he sent this back. He said, and he also said, we really need to study consciousness, not psychic phenomena. They're the outer manifestation. So Mitchell wrote back a letter and said, he really didn't agree with this, that he thought there was value in studying psychic phenomena. So Gopi Krishna was in Zurich at that time, so he got Mitchell's letter. And that night, he sat down and started to write in rhyming couplet verse. And he wrote, in the next day or two, he wrote more than 1,300 lines of rhyming couplet verse. Talking about, if you wish your research to have the same validity as a walk on the moon and whatever. This is also published in the book From the Unseen. I added it in later. So he did this on a number of occasions. He wrote these literally small books in verse, just off of the top, just out of his mind like that. And this really in India, in ancient India, this was regarded as the hallmark of true enlightenment. It wasn't that you could produce psychic phenomenon or do amazing yogic feats and be buried alive for days. Not at all. What the hallmark of really true enlightenment was inspired verse. And even to the point where if a person claimed to be enlightened, they would be posed profound spiritual questions. They would have to answer them instantly at length in verse. And so he had this ability where this poetry would just come to him. And he said it was almost like droplets, like snowflakes coming down from above, and they get to a certain point where they would crystallize into a particular shape, and they would be in his mind for a few seconds, and then they'd be gone, and he'd instantly have to write them down or dictate them. So, we have published, I think, 5 of his books of poetry amongst the others that we've done. So this, to me, was one of the most amazing things about the man. He was also very humble. He had no interest in power. He took no disciples at any time in his life, ever. The small group of Canadians who went to India for those 7 years, we were there to work. That's what we did. We worked. We weren't sitting at his feet, staring up lovingly at him. We were out there, going to presses, going to libraries, shipping books, doing research and all that kind of thing. So he never took any disciples. He lived an extremely simple life. He had only the basic necessities, and he had although he was quite competent at handling money, he had no interest in accumulating it, except for what it could do to promote his message that he wanted to get out to the world. And so, he had these traits. And another thing that was really amazing about him was back in the 1950s, after he retired from his government service, he decided to set up an organization in Kashmir to help those who were disadvantaged in some way, particularly by society, and more specifically to help women who had been disadvantaged. And he set up these centers where they would take in women who were, say, pregnant out of wedlock, or their husbands had died, and there was no social support system there. Either they had someone to support them or they starved. And he would have teachers come in and teach them weaving and other skills. And so it was almost like having women's shelters back in the 1950s, when that kind of thing was unheard of. Until the day he died, he was involved in this organization in Kashmir that helped the disadvantaged. He would find marriages for women who had no dowry, because without a dowry, a woman just couldn't get married. No man would marry her. So he would arrange the members of his organization, maybe one of them would have a son who was of marriageable age. That son would marry one of the women and not ask for any dowry. So he was really devoted to doing service work. And he emphasized over and over again how important this is for someone who aspires to enlightenment, that they must demonstrate that they have this aspect to their nature, something which you don't generally hear about when people are talking about how to awaken Kundalini and how to become spiritual. They don't so much talk about that, but it is extremely important to devote a portion of your life. So he died in 1984, and since then, his books and other things have sold steadily, but his ideas have never caught on. And this is extremely unfortunate as far as I'm concerned, because he had the key to understanding Kundalini in a way which is really easy to understand. You can understand Kundalini in a number of different ways. So, for instance, you can go back and try and understand it from the Indian spiritual tradition. But there are several problems with this. One of them being that this tradition came into being at a time when knowledge of subjects like anatomy, physiology, neuroscience, genetics, microbiology, physics, and chemistry, they were either non-existent or extremely rudimentary. So they just didn't have that knowledge. The second problem with the Indian spiritual tradition is that when Westerners try to study it, they usually study it in English. And unless you really study it with a knowledge of the Sanskrit, you really won't understand it. It can be very confusing. Excuse me. It can be very confusing and give all sorts of incorrect ideas. And very few people are willing to do that. So I see ideas, people talk about Kundalini all the time, and I can see where they're coming from, but I also understand that if they had gone back and studied the real paradigm of reality of the Indian spiritual tradition, which you need to know to understand Kundalini, they would really not be saying the things that they do. So that is really an avenue which, although in itself is not very productive, what Gopi Krishna did was he took two of the concepts out of the Indian spiritual tradition and he brought them into the modern science. One of those concepts was consciousness as being the primary reality. And the second one was the existence of what he called the Pranic Spectrum. And he said this is a super intelligent medium that's associated with our physical bodies and with all life, actually, that is majorly involved in how life operates. And I can maybe talk about this a bit later. But he said, unless those two aspects of the Indian spiritual tradition are brought into modern science, science will never understand Kundalini. They will never understand it. And so he put enlightenment and Kundalini into a context that is easily understandable. And this is in a context which virtually every one of you, I'm sure, is familiar with. And that context is evolution. Now, what he said was, and I think everybody here, who's listening probably is aware of this, that the goal of spiritual transformation, in whatever form it takes, is enlightenment or higher consciousness or cosmic consciousness or unity consciousness. I've been hearing lately, I prefer the term enlightened consciousness. That's the term I prefer for that state of mind, which is a state of mind that Gopi Krishna had after the 12 years of transformation. That was where, the person can allow their mind to be immersed in this ocean of consciousness. So he said that the goal of spiritual transformation is enlightenment. And what enlightenment is, and this is the key thing to understand, he said, it is a new faculty of perception, slowly but steadily evolving in the human brain, which is as advanced from and as distinct from normal human consciousness as normal human consciousness is from instinctive animal consciousness. So it's a new faculty of perception, totally new. And it is as advanced from and as distinct from normal consciousness as normal is from instinctive animal consciousness. So how does normal consciousness differ from instinctive animal consciousness, first of all? Well, I think every one of us probably has a reasonably good idea of what instinctive animal consciousness is. When an animal is tired, it sleeps. When it's hungry, it eats. When it feels the urge to procreate, it finds a member of the opposite sex and procreates. Its behavior is locked into that. It cannot deviate from that behavior very far. And just as a sideline, even though science has labeled this, instinct, to be honest, I have never come across any explanation for how instinct works. As far as I'm concerned, science, they've labeled it, but they don't understand it at all. But that's a subject for another day. So how does normal human consciousness differ from instinctive animal consciousness? Well, there are a number of ways in which it differs. We are more self-aware. We have much better impulse control, things like that. But the major difference, for the purposes of today's discussion here, is that we have this highly evolved, powerful intellect. And it is this intellect which has given us the power to transform the world, literally to even transform the ecosystem of the planet on which we live, for better or for worse. And it is this intellect which distinguishes us from all other species on Earth. Now, what is it about the intellect that really can sort of capture its importance in a succinct way? What the intellect has done is it has given us access to aspects of creation that are hidden from all other species as far as we know. And just let me get a sip of water. So what are these aspects of creation it's revealed to us? Well, first of all, there are the laws of nature, the physical forces, the constants, the speed of light, many things like that. Then there is cosmology, galaxies and black holes and dark matter, dark energy, relativity. Then there's the scale of the universe on the microscopic level, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, quarks, and most importantly, the periodic table of elements, which has unlocked the secrets of physical matter. Then there's the quantum realm. Then there are other subjects like genetics and microbiology. But last but not least of the major things that it's revealed to us is mathematics, because mathematics is the driving tool behind all scientific discoveries in the last several hundred years. Without mathematics, we would have a very different world. But mathematics is a total conundrum to modern science. It is at the same time the only thing we know of that is totally objective, in that it describes the physical creation from end to end, every aspect of how the creation behaves. But at the same time, it is totally subjective. It's a mental construct. And there is nothing else we know of that is like that. And by understanding Kundalini in the Indian spiritual tradition, you can understand why. It's perfectly obvious why this is the case. But to science, it's a total conundrum. This is an example of how bringing these concepts in from the Indian spiritual tradition could really aid modern science. Anyway, so this is the difference, that we are now aware of these aspects of reality through our physical senses and through our intellect. And I don't think anyone would disagree with the proposition that this evolution of our intellect is based upon some kind of difference in our brain, that our brain is different from other species on the planet, either in a structural way or a biochemical way, or maybe an energetic way, or quite likely all three of these. Science doesn't know why exactly, but I think it's safe to say that it is some organic change in our brain which has been responsible for this step in evolution. So what Gopi Krishna said is, this evolution has not stopped. It's still going on. Now, science believes more or less that evolution is finished, that with the advent of mankind, with our powerful intellect, we are the acme of creation. There is nothing possible beyond the human mind and intellect, essentially because they can't imagine anything beyond that. And even though they may deny that that's what they believe, if you look at the finality with which they regard their views, it's quite obvious that they do believe that they've got the market on reality cornered. And so science really, in essence, believes that evolution is finished. But Gopi Krishna said, no, this is not the case. He said, there is a new faculty of perception evolving in the human brain, and this faculty is very different from the intellect. And it is different in the sense that whereas the intellect, through our five physical senses, has given us access to new aspects of the physical creation, he said this new sense, this new faculty gives us direct perception of, and I emphasize that, direct perception of a higher order of reality from which the entire physical creation, the entire universe, emanates from or is projected from. And this higher order of reality is consciousness. He said it's an infinitely aware, infinitely intelligent, infinitely knowing consciousness. Now, of course, this concept of an infinite deity or consciousness or whatever is prevalent in all the great spiritual traditions under different names. In India, it is referred to as Brahman or Purusha. In the West, we have, God of Christianity, Allah in Islam. So all the great spiritual traditions have this concept in them. Personally, I like to refer to this new faculty of perception as transcendent consciousness, or this I shouldn't say new faculty of perception, this new order of reality as transcendent consciousness, because it literally transcends time, space, and causality. And so he said, it is this ability to directly perceive this with our mind, not with our physical senses, with our mind. This is what is enlightened consciousness, this new faculty of perception. However, it is the ability to perceive this to the degree that is possible for a finite mind, like an organic brain, because obviously we cannot perceive transcendent consciousness in its entirety, because we would have to be infinite ourselves. And from the point of view of, or to use an Einsteinian term, from the frame of reference of embodied consciousness, we are not infinite, we are finite. So it is the ability to perceive this higher order of reality. Now, in people with a normal state of consciousness, this happens in what we call a mystical experience, a genuine mystical experience. And because our normal consciousness cannot sustain this state for very long, it is transient. Mystical experiences only last for a few moments, a few seconds, or even a few hours. But it is something that if it happens to a person, it will transform them. They will be different after. They will be different in many ways. And to give you an example of this, one aspect of the way in which this transforms a person is that they will no longer have any fear of death. Now, this is not a belief that they are eternal or immortal, that the spark of consciousness within us is eternal or immortal. It is the knowledge that this is the case. Now, how can they have that knowledge? And here we can use an example from all of our own experience to illustrate this difference. If I were to say to you that when you go to sleep tonight and you're dreaming, if for some reason you're killed, you die in your dream, that you'll actually be dead, what would your response be? Well, for most people, they just laugh. Like, no, that's not the way it works. I know that I can't die in my dream because my dream is a construct of my mind. You can't say that it has no reality, but it has less reality than the waking state. When I come from the dream state to the waking state, I recognize the dream as a construct of my mind. Now, the mystical state, the state we perceive with this new faculty, is another order of reality beyond that. And so a person who has had a mystical experience knows by direct perception of the mystical, of this transcendent consciousness, that what we perceive in the waking state is not real, in the sense that it is a projection of consciousness. So it's the same thing. We go from dream state to waking state. We go from less real to more real. And we go from waking state to, in India, this is called the Turiya state. We go to this fourth state of consciousness, the other state being dreamless sleep. We go to this fourth state of consciousness, and it is orders of reality more real. And if you think about the transition, like let's say you're having a dream and you're being pursued by some terrible beast that you know that when it catches you, it's going to tear you to pieces. And no matter how fast you run, you can't get away from it. Then just as this beast is about to grab you in its jaws and kill you, you wake up and you go, oh, thank God, that was only a dream. Now think about that transition from less real to real. Now magnify that by 100 times. And you will have a glimpse of what it is like to go from the waking state to the mystical state. And people who have this experience, they will say things like, it is more solid than solid. It is more real than real. And I've never perceived it. I'm only repeating my understanding of it. But this is why people who have a mystical experience have no fear of death. And this is what one thing that distinguishes a mystical experience from a drug experience. I don't know of anyone who has come back from a drug experience saying that they now know without any shadow of a doubt that the spark of consciousness within us is only an aspect of the transcendent consciousness and that it is eternal. And so it is this new faculty of perception, which is what Gopi Krishna said. He said, eventually this will become a feature of every member of the human race. Everybody born today possesses an intellect. Although, to be honest, after some of the recent events, I'm not so sure about that. But everybody born today has an intellect. He said, in the future, it may take hundreds or thousands of years. Everybody born will be born into a state of enlightenment or enlightened consciousness. And so it is something that will take time. But what we see with people who are having Kundalini experiences, it is like it is coming in fits and starts. It's not all at once. And there is a whole spectrum of experiences that happen as Kundalini becomes active. There are psychic phenomena, there are creative abilities and talents, traits of genius can show up in a person they never had before. And then there is finally the mystical perception. So as Kundalini becomes more and more active, we see all these various traits come into being, either in groups or one at a time. And this is what Kundalini is trying to do. It's trying to accelerate the evolution of the human race so that we can perceive reality in a higher form. And this is what Gopi Krishna was trying to convince science to really undertake a study of, is to show that it's a transformation in the brain physically, which is responsible for this. Excuse me. The problem with talking about spiritual experiences to a scientist is that they have no way to make it real. And oftentimes, I think that their attitude is, well, when they hear someone say, oh, I had this mystical experience or whatever, they go, well, it's either just some kind of bizarre mental condition, or at worst, it's a pathology, it's a mental illness. However, if you put it on the footing of being a new faculty of perception, which is evolving in us, it puts it on a really firm scientific footing that, if it can be validated, will literally transform the world. So that, in a nutshell, is what Gopi Krishna was trying to accomplish. And now that I've explained transcendent consciousness, I can give you a bit better idea of what Kundalini is, because this is critically important to understand. In the Indian spiritual tradition, creation happens in a very different way than science explains it with the Big Bang theory. It's not contradictory to science, because the scientific paradigm actually is contained within the Indian paradigm, but it is very different. And what the Indian paradigm says is that, and as I described in Gopi Krishna's experience from his autobiography, that the physical world that the creation we experience with our senses is projected from within us. And this is how creation happens in the Indian tradition. Now, without Kundalini, or to be more precise, Kundalini Shakti, if creation happened without Kundalini Shakti, the universe would be a sea of dead, insentient matter, just atoms and molecules banging against each other. There'd be no life, because Kundalini is the essence of life. Life cannot exist without it. And so Kundalini is responsible for, just to go back, it is actually an aspect of this transcendent consciousness, which is responsible for the creation of life. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, one of the great misconceptions that people have about Kundalini, especially people in whom it started to work spontaneously, just out of the blue, they're walking along one day and bingo, they're having Kundalini experiences, having energy flowing up the spine. having psychic experiences, they're having all these things happen, and they think, oh my God, this is something that's totally foreign and to the human. I've never experienced this before. It's something new and radical and different. In actual fact, everyone alive today, every single human being alive today, and everyone who has ever been born went through a major Kundalini transformation. It began the moment they were a fertilized ovum in the womb of their mother, and it ended more or less, not completely, but more or less, on the day that they were born. Now, if you ask a scientist, they will, of course, it will be, fiction to them, imaginings. However, when I started studying microbiology, and I saw how Kundalini worked, I was quite amazed, not only with what it didn't explain about how life worked, but how it only seemed to apply to cells. So, for instance, we know about so many tens of thousands of genes in the human genome, and we know mostly what the purpose of these are. It's only a small fraction of the genes in our genome, but we know what the purpose of many of these thousands of genes are. But what they actually do is they're assembly instructions for the cell components like proteins and enzymes. But if you ask a microbiologist or a geneticist, well, where in our genome does it say that the human body has 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 nose, and that our head is sitting on top of our shoulders and not sticking out our butts? They won't be able to tell you. All they will be able to say is, well, we've been able to link up some genes with physical organs in the body, but we're just assuming that since it's the only information storage system that exists in the body, it's got to be there somewhere. We just haven't found it yet. And then you say, well, what about how the body is assembled, like, say, an organ like the eye or the liver? Very complex, multi-stage processes. Where are the assembly instructions for these? And you'll get the same answer. Well, they have to be there somewhere. But then if you ask the same scientist, well, how does it build the fetus in the womb? They won't be able to answer you. Because if you look at what happens with the information in DNA that we know about, it's a very simple causal physical process between this DNA and say a feature like eye color. So you have this numeric information in a gene. It gets copied into a strand of mRNA, messenger RNA, which we've all heard about, thankful to COVID. That strand of mRNA is picked up by a molecular machine called a ribosome, which, based upon the numeric information in the gene sequence, starts to assemble a long string of amino acids into a chain. When that chain emerges from the ribosome, it folds up into a particular shape. And that shape determines not only its function, but the frequencies of light that it reflects and absorbs. So one particular flavor of that gene, depending on the code, the iris of the eye will absorb the blue frequencies or the non-blue frequencies and reflect the blue frequencies. Therefore, your eye appears blue. Perfectly logical, a causal physical chain from the DNA to the color of your eye. But if you say, well, where is the mechanism that converts the information in our DNA into an organ like the eye or the liver or the lungs or whatever? They have no idea. And this was a real shock to me that science, really, I regard this as the best kept secret in modern science, that they don't know how the body is assembled in the womb outside of cell components. And the only term I've heard recently to try and describe it is, it self-replicates. Well, I may be missing something, but that doesn't do much to explain it to me. You can give it a label, but how does that explain how it works? They really do not know. And so it is Kundalini Shakti that is guiding and controlling the construction of the fetus in the womb. And in consciousness, the new paradigm, the book I wrote, I described some discoveries I made about how by changing our understanding of consciousness, we can see how something like Kundalini Shakti can actually control physical processes. And it's too detailed to go into right now. But it is through quantum processes that Kundalini Shakti controls the development of the fetus in the womb. Now, what happens is 9 months later, after the ovum is fertilized, we're born into the world, and Kundalini goes into, I won't call it a dormant state because it's still active, but you might call it a quiescent phase. And then later in life, depending on many different factors, some of which are the person's lifestyle, their spiritual practices, their diet, their health, their occupation, Kundalini can start to become active again. But instead of building a new body, because you've already got one, it rebuilds the brain and the nervous system so that we can have this enhanced faculty of perception. And so this is what Gopi Krishna described when he said he'd wake up in the middle of the night and there'd be this storm of activity in his body. However, unfortunately, for many people, this process does not go smoothly. And there's a number of reasons why it doesn't go smoothly, which is really too much to talk about in detail today. But I know because a lot of people who come to the collective are curious about this. Why is this happening to me? Why is it so difficult and problematic? A large proportion of the difficulties come from the fact that the prana in the body, this energy that fuels this state of consciousness, is not pure. The energy going to the brain up the spinal cord is impure, and it's impure because of our lifestyle. People drink, smoke, do recreational drugs, don't get enough sleep, don't get enough exercise, eat unhealthy food, and all of these tend to toxify the prana in the body. And so Kundalini cannot work in a healthy way while the prana going to the brain is toxified. Anyway, just to go back to what I was saying, so Kundalini restarts later in a person's life, sometimes not, and this is what happens. Now, one thing I like about Gopi Krishna's ideas of putting this into the context of evolution is it makes it global. It is something which is independent of any spiritual tradition or spiritual practice or whatever. So because you are looking at it as a physiological process going on in the human body rather than some sort of psychological transformation, it has a reality to it that it has a very firm footing in something that can be studied and understood. And it also has the effect of eliminating the differences between one faith and another. Because when you understand that all faiths are trying to encourage the awakening of Kundalini or to facilitate spiritual transformation, not so much by the philosophy that they have about the deity or whatever, but by the lifestyle guidelines they provide, the 10 Commandments, the Noble Eightfold Path of Buddha. These are the core of all the various faiths, and they all say much the same thing. Live a life, with a virtuous life, live honestly, truthfully, help others, be frugal. These are all the qualities and characteristics to accelerate our evolution. So Gopi Krishna's ideas can go a long way to unifying the various religious faiths and the strife that goes on between them. So I think those are the major points I wanted to make. I'm sure Samir has some questions that he'd like to put to me, and I'll leave it at that for now.
I suppose this might not be very chronological in the conversation, because it's a question that perhaps is best asked towards the end of the conversation. Before we started, we were just talking, and something that's really close to my heart is the importance of Kundalini in the evolutionary sense, and about really, in essence, how how will humanity address the problems that it has created? And it seems like things are coming to a head in lots of ways. And what is Kundalini's role in a way in helping humanity, hopefully, to address the problems that humanity has created? So I wonder, Michael, if you could talk a bit about around that, and how how can Kundalini and in the evolutionary sense so help humankind to divert from its destructive path?
Well, that's an excellent question, Samir. Really excellent question. And excuse me, I think I'm getting hoarse from talking too much. So Gopi Krishna pointed out that if Kundalini is the new faculty of perception, which is coming to us as a consequence of evolution, one of the things about it that it is critically important to understand is that it is a predetermined goal. Now, science, of course, with its theory of Darwinian or neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, this is nonsense. As far as science is concerned, evolution happens in a totally random way, random genetic mutations based upon or put through the filter of natural selection to weed out non-viable forms of life. However, there's one big problem with this, or there's many problems. One of the big ones is this, is that it is virtually undeniable that over long spans of time, like billions of years, life has tended to evolve in general from species of a simpler nature to ones of a more complex nature with more advanced faculties of sense and mind. So originally there was just single, single-celled organisms. And about, 650 million years ago, we have an explosion of life in the oceans, a multicellular life. Then a couple of 100 million years later, we have reptiles and amphibians as life moved on to the land. Then dinosaurs. Then when they were wiped out, we have mammals, and then primates, and then hominids, and finally Homo sapiens. So we see this very clear, undeniable progression of life. But how can this be random? If the only controlling factor in evolution is viability, which is what science believes, then you would expect to see that the newer life forms are more viable than the older ones. But this is not the case. You have species like sharks and turtles that have been around for hundreds of millions of years. They're still here. And the most advanced species, humanity, we are on the very verge of destroying ourselves, either through nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons of mass destruction, or the destruction of the very ecosystem that gives us life. So this trend in evolution, which is so pronounced and so undeniable, is unexplainable by science's theory of evolution. So even though science will object to Gopi Krishna's idea, I would just challenge him and say, okay, first of all, explain why evolution has happened this way. So the key point here is that there is a predetermined goal to evolution. And Gopi Krishna, what he said about it was that in order for us to reach that goal, we have to limit our behavior, our lifestyle, in a number of ways. And the lifestyle that is being led by the vast majority of people on the planet today is inimical to that process. A lifestyle where, we have poor diets. So many people are taking, intoxicating drugs, alcohol, tobacco, and working at jobs where the only thing that matters is getting the bigger car, the bigger house, the fatter paycheck, and it's get ahead no matter what you have to do to get ahead. And so he said this particular lifestyle, which is focused almost totally on materiality, is inimical to this process of evolution. And he said that it is literally responsible for many of the ills that we see in society today. It has been responsible for wars, revolutions, terrorism, drug abuse, interpersonal abuse, many neuroses and psychoses. It is this fact that we are ignorant of this evolutionary process. And you can kind of draw a parallel to the physical world and our state of health. For thousands of years, humanity didn't know anything about viruses and microbes and bacteria. And of course, we led lifestyles which were inimical to our physical health. We didn't, we lived in unclean lifestyles. If there was a pandemic, we didn't bother to isolate people. When we discovered microbes and bacteria, we suddenly went, oh, we have to live in a different way. We have to live a clean life. We have to wash our hands before we eat. We have to make sure that we are not bringing these microbes and bacteria into our body. So we modified our behavior in order to have physical health. It's exactly the same for our mental health, but we don't know it. Our mental health is dependent on our lifestyle and our overall behavior in that way. So as far as Gopi Krishna was concerned, unless we discover, and science has to discover this, that evolution is not finished and that there is this new faculty emerging and that is a predetermined goal, humanity essentially is doomed. We will destroy ourselves one way or the other, or degenerate into, a mindless species through misuse of technology. And so this is why he devoted his life, and why all the rest of us at I.C.R, why we devoted, for me, it's going on 48 years now. Like all my spare time and energy is going into making this known, because it is so important that it be known for the health and well-being and survival of the race.
I've got two questions. I think one might be better for a second interview. It's a large question, so I'll hold that. But the second question relates to what you mentioned earlier on. You said there were two aspects of the Indian or tantric system about reality that are relevant for science. One is consciousness, which I completely agree with. Mm-hmm. And the second one is a pranic spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
Just within
the second one, if that's what you're asking about.
Yeah,
that's Gopi Krishna's term. The concept of prana is essential to the Indian spiritual tradition. Prana has a dual connotation of life and breath in Sanskrit. And without prana, there would be no life. It is the medium through which the transcendent consciousness, Kundalini Shakti, Prana Shakti, and other forms of Shakti, it is the medium through which it works to direct life processes. And I could literally do a whole talk on it alone. It's an information storage medium, it's a communications medium, and it's an energy transfer medium. And for thousands of years, psychics have talked about how they could perceive this aura around the body. This is the pranic spectrum. It's the medium through which genetic traits are passed outside of the ones that aren't in the genes. So, for instance, the form of the human body, or for individuals, like instinct. How is instinct passed? It's through the pranic spectrum. So it's an extremely key concept that I would have to talk about at more length, but we can maybe do that another time.
So I'm currently working on a film, and one of the ideas is looking at the nature of reality, which a lot of these experiences are showing us, as you quite rightly said, that perhaps the fundamental nature of reality is non-material, potentially consciousness. And there are some indications in physics. For example, the Nobel Prize in 2022 went to 3 physicists who proved experimentally in quantum entanglement, suggesting in non-locality that everything is connected, everything is non-local. Mm-hmm. Also, there are theories in information science that the universe is just information. Everything is information, and that might tie in with your idea of the pranic spectrum. So just unpicking where, what you're saying is fundamentally what you're suggesting is that the reason why science let's say, stuck sometimes or hits a brick wall, is because it views reality as material. And in actual fact, we're non-material. Could you just clarify, is that what you're saying?
Well, again, it's important to understand that the process of creation, as it's understood in the Indian tradition, that we project the physical creation from within ourselves. And this is a very difficult thing for people to wrap their minds around. The physical world is real, but it's what science is doing is it's as an analogy, it's trying to understand how a movie gets projected onto a movie screen, like say you're in a theater watching a film. It's trying to understand how a movie gets projected by studying what's going on in the film. It's not looking at the projector, the light bulb, the beams of light, or the white screen. It's looking at the events in the picture. And so it can only go so far. It's not a great analogy, but at least it gives an idea that until you understand this process of projection, you can't understand Kundalini. And science is stuck, as you said, they're stuck in the movie. They can't let go of the movie. And it's not such a bad analogy in a way, because even when we're watching a movie, even though it's just beams of light on a white screen, we perceive it as real. I mean, I don't know about you, but when that Tyrannosaurus Rex was chasing that Jeep with Jeff Goldblum in the back in the first Jurassic Park movie, I was rooted to my seat. It was like, you could have dropped an atomic bomb beside me and I wouldn't have noticed it. So we can make something seem incredibly real, which is totally inconsequential. Think about it when it's something far more profound, where it's coming through our physical senses. So yes, science is not really going to be able to get past a certain point.
So what Gopi Krishna was saying is that, are we co-creating reality together? Are we all 7.2 billion people? Are we projecting reality out? Is there a consensus in reality between these 7.2 billion people that we are collaborating to create this reality?
Yeah, that's a question that is a very profound one. And the only answer I think he ever gave that really could give some sort of an idea was he said, we cast shadows on each other's minds, that we're kind of like, here's an analogy which might help to explain it. I'm giving away my age here, but when I was a kid, television was very different from what it is now. There was a TV station with, a movie projector or movie cameras, and it went to a radio tower that broadcast the signals to our TV. And the projection system, just trying to think of what I meant to say. I'm getting a bit tired. So there was this projection system, where we had all these channels, and consciousness is kind of like the TV, the various TVs in the broadcast area. That you maybe had 10,000 TVs in the broadcast area. They were all manifesting exactly the same picture. However, consciousness is somewhat different in that we are all manifesting if we're closely associated with someone, a relatively similar picture. We're in the same environment, we have the same sensory information coming in, but everybody has their own picture that they're experiencing. So it's kind of like that. It's in fact, I think in one of his articles he described it as a central broadcasting station of mind. And you can take this analogy a little bit further even and say that what is happening with Kundalini is, when I was a kid, and this really gives my age away, TV was in black and white. You had like a black and white movie camera in the TV station. The signal was broadcast in black and white. You had a black and white television manifesting the picture. Now, at some point, they started to upgrade and they started broadcasting the programs in color. However, our TV set couldn't get color. All we could see was the black and white component of the signal. So we had to upgrade our television to a color TV in order to see that new, much more detailed and rich version of reality. So in a sense, this is what Kundalini is doing. The TV signal was there with the color information in it. We couldn't perceive it with our television. We couldn't receive it with our television. So it's kind of like Kundalini is upgrading the brains of individual humans to perceive this higher order of reality. So that's kind of the best answer I can give to that question.
I mean, I was still thinking about the idea of co-creation reality, in the sense that, Mike, would you say that human beings are part of creating reality, or are we receivers, or are we part? Is the reality coming through us? No, are we, in that sense, are we actually creating co-creating the reality, or are we somehow translators of a reality coming through us? Does that make sense?
It does. The background of everything is consciousness. And in the Indian spiritual tradition, it says that the order of creation is the first order of creation is what's called Maya Shakti, where a spark of that infinite consciousness is made finite. The next portion of that projection system is where it's called Prakriti Shakti. It is where, through our brain and then our physical senses, our brain and mind and physical senses, the external world is projected, similar to the way a movie is projected on a screen. So it projects, first of all, through the mind. And there are three functional aspects to mind. There is buddhi, or our intellect, ahamkar, which roughly corresponds to the ego. And there is manas, which is our sensory perceptions of the external world. And so as it goes through these various aspects of our mind, it also is colored by the pranic spectrum. And so the pranic spectrum is what links us up to other people, like through telepathy, clairvoyance, and things like that. But as we go through this creation process, our mind influences what gets projected. So it sort of colors what is coming through, the beams that are coming through from the projector. And so we each have our own individual reality, which we are creating. But the consciousness behind all of the individuals is the same consciousness. Like I said, it's like a TV station. So I hope that kind of helps. But this illustrates what I was saying earlier about mathematics. That science can't understand why it's objective and subjective. Mathematics is an aspect of transcendent consciousness. And it uses mathematics to build the physical creation with, all the laws, in the same way that we use mathematics to build a computer game, like a video game. The video games are all mathematics. So this transcendent consciousness uses mathematics to create the physical reality. And so it's a similar process that we use to do video games. And that's why it comes through our mind, and we perceive a subset of mathematics, because we only perceive a bit of it, not the whole thing. But it originates in consciousness. Therefore, you have your answer. How can it be objective and subjective at the same time? Total conundrum to science, easily explained by this system. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. No, thank you. I'm really, this is, normally I would have plenty of time, but I'm really unfortunate today. There's something that special, and I really just can't not go to. So my apologies for having to leave now, because this is getting very interesting.
Thanks, Michael. We're going to end it here for this first podcast. It's been really fascinating and very, very interesting. We'll keep on the conversation. We'll do part 2 in the next week or two, and we'll put them up together. And also in the notes of the videos, we'll put your details and links and website details and books, etc. We'll put all that in the description below the video. So thanks a lot, Michael. We look forward to the second podcast very soon.
I look forward to it very much as well.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thank you.
My pleasure.